So I wanted to spend some time today talking to you guys about Nexus Hyperfabric. This was announced several months ago I believe, at Partner Summit. It's going to go orderable on February 10th. And between then and now, we've spent a lot of time, as Jim indicated, with our national partners, some of our launch partners, getting them trained, getting them qualified. We'll talk about what all of that means to get prepped for launch. And so now we're circling back on the rest of our partners, which is why I wanted to talk to you guys about this today. So before we get into the slides, I want to try and set the stage for what Hyperfabric is and isn't. And, that's not maybe so simple as a couple bullet points. So it's going to take me a minute or two to talk through it. But in short, Nexus Hyperfabric is Cisco's newest data center fabric. It is cloud managed. So there's basically a SaaS portal similar to Intersight, but obviously dedicated for Nexus Hyperfabric. And the solution is not intended to be a replacement for either NXOS or ACI. There's been some rumors that, ACI is on its way out, or, Cisco's leaving that behind. That's absolutely untrue. ACI has a very healthy roadmap, and there's quite a bit of work going on right now, both on the NXOS side as well as the ACI side, to establish better interoperability between those two platforms. So that kind of comes down to the Nexus One experience messaging. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but basically, making sure that we have layer 2 and layer 3 forwarding between the fabrics, VXLAN compatibility, security policy that's uniform across the fabrics, et cetera, right? So neither one of those traditional data center solutions are going away. This is really intended more for greenfield data center builds, co-locations. We'll get into some of the additional use cases. But the idea behind this is really, to put it at a super high level, is for it to be an easy button fabric that is AI ready. Okay, and we'll get into the details of what that means. But since I was mentioning NXOS and ACI, there's not going to be feature compatibility between Hyperfabric and NXOS or ACI. So if your customer, I guess I'll say one other thing before I get into that. From a skill set perspective, this is not going to require a CCIE to be on staff. So with that said, if your customer's data center use case requires a high degree of configuration customization, where they would have someone like a CCIE on staff, you're going to want to stick with NXOS and ACI from a positioning perspective. If the customer that you're looking at maybe has a smaller staff, lesser skills, is less focused on the customization of the fabric, and is more focused on an outcome, like, getting busy with our AI workloads, and I just want the network to work, right? I want to stand it up quickly. I want it to run. I don't want to have to think too much about it. This is the solution that you should be looking for or looking at. Okay. So from a network as a service perspective, this is an area of the market that's growing about 35% year over year, projected over the next several years. And some people will compare this solution to Meraki, right? Because Meraki has that cloud management controller over all the switches. We've got 4 million plus customers on that now. So we feel like that's a pretty popular solution. And this is sort of the data center version of that. So there's quite a bit to talk about on this slide. But I'm going to start with this sort of tape down here at the bottom. I'm going to start on the left here with design. So I mentioned that the SaaS portal is similar to Intersight. So before you think of any physical hardware at all, this is hosted on AWS. It is multi-tenant capable. It supports RBAC. This particular portal was built with managed services in mind. So if that's something you want to do for your customers, that will be possible. So you'll be able to log into the portal before you create any networks, right? Order any equipment. So within the portal, what you'll do is you will, from a design perspective, you will create a blueprint. And a blueprint basically represents like a location. It could be a colo, could be a data center, could be an edge location, doesn't matter. We support multiple types of topologies. So we support a mesh topology between 1 and 5 switches, which obviously fit your smaller deployment scenarios and edge location type situations. And we also support a spine leaf topology that can support up to 4 spines and 32 leafs, which will give us just shy of 2,000 host-facing ports. And so being able to design networks that fit all the way from 1 switch up to 2,000 ports, we feel like that addresses the need of a large swath of customers, maybe not super large enterprise or service provider, but certainly the segment that I was discussing earlier, smaller shops, lesser skills, looking for the fabric to just work. Okay, so there's 2 physical switches, and we'll get into the models a little later. And I'm going to kind of use the diagram on this slide to speak to this. But when I mentioned the mesh topology, there's basically a leaf switch and a spine switch model. And if the only model that you add to your blueprint is the leaf switch, then you're building a mesh network. Okay, if you add spine and leaf switches to your blueprint, then you're building a spine leaf network. And like I said, you can dynamically change all of that. And then once the design is complete, those are basically like placeholders for the hardware. They're slots, if you will, right? And so there's the first thing that you can do with the design is you can export a layer 1 cable plant. You can hand that to your facilities team so that when all the hardware shows up on site, they know how to plug it all together, right? The second thing you can do is you can export a bill of materials. And that's going to give you not only the switch hardware, but the optics, the cabling, the power cables, basically everything you need to get things up and running, and makes ordering really, really simple. So while the order is in process and the hardware is shipping to you, you can then, quote, configure your blueprint. So this is where I want to talk a little bit about like the management strategy behind this fabric. It's a hybrid management strategy. So what that means is that Cisco owns the hardware, right? We maintain responsibility over the physical switches. We maintain responsibility over the operating system. We maintain responsibility over operating system upgrades. However, we're not just going to reboot switches in the middle of the day. Customers will have the ability to say, this is when we will allow you to reboot the switches. We manage the entire underlay, right? Which is a VXLAN EVPN underlay. So when the hardware arrives on site, similar to Intersight, there's like a claim and bind process. So the claim process is sort of like saying these switches will belong to this fabric or this blueprint, but the bind process is where you assign a specific piece of hardware into one of these slots that you see in the diagram. So what's cool about that is licensing. This is where licensing differs somewhat from how ACI works. A license is actually applied to a slot, not to a specific hardware serial number. And what that does is it encourages customers to participate in an on-site hardware sparing strategy. And that's possible because the way that this solution is priced is, let's put it, light on the hardware costs and heavier on the software subscription and licensing costs. So, for example, let's say you've got a spine switch that dies. All you have to do is unbind that physical hardware from that slot, RMA it, and then bring in one of your on-site spares and, cable it up, plug it in, and then bind it back into that slot. And so the license is basically transferable between the 2 serial numbers on those hardware devices. Hopefully that makes sense. So it makes hardware replacement much easier than it was in ACI, right? There were some hoops you kind of needed to jump through with ACI. So now that you've got all of your switches bound into the slots on your blueprint, this is where the configuration, particularly the underlay, is automatically deployed by Cisco onto your switches. And so if in the future you need to expand your network, you can go back to your blueprint, you can add an additional leaf switch, and the network will basically converge and add the connectivity, the logical connectivity needed to extend VXLAN EVPN to that additional switch. You could do the same thing with spine switches up to 4. Okay. The other configuration that would be worked on by the customer and what the customer owns is basically the data plane, right? So any layer 2 VLANs or VNIs, layer 3 routing, in particular BGP to the outside world, or any SVIs or VNI, layer 3 VNIs that you need to configure into Fabric, that would be the responsibility of the customer. And so that can all be designed or configured prior to binding your switches too. So basically everything, all the configuration happens in the cloud and gets pushed down onto the physical hardware. And at that point, you're up and running, right? And so all of your monitoring, upgrade processes, etc., is all going to happen through the SaaS controller. Any questions so far before we move on to the next slide? Is this all making sense?
Yes, for the most part. Kind of need to see it in, see it in a lab or something.
Yeah, understood. Unfortunately, I don't have anything I can demo off of just yet. Hopefully, we're going to get something in dCloud soon or some other solution. But yeah, that's why I'm trying to elaborate and give the best description I can, because I don't have anything I can show.
All good. You're doing awesome.
Okay. All right, cool. So from a complete portfolio perspective, on the right side of this diagram, this is where we're talking about traditional Fabric, right? NXOS, ACI, for enterprise, for service provider, for web scale type data center deployments, and of course, all of that is managed under Nexus Dashboard. On the left, this is where Hyperfabric comes in. It's got its own SaaS management platform. And this is where we see it fitting from a use case perspective, or a sector perspective, I should say. So commercial, public sector, and distributed data center edge, right? Smaller edge locations. Now, in the lower left, you'll see down here a reference to Cisco 6000 series switches. We used to have the Nexus 6000, but those are end of sale, end of life, and we haven't used that namespace, so to speak. So we are going back to Nexus 6000. We wanted it to be Nexus because we don't want to lead customers away from our data center brand, which is built around Nexus. But these switches do not run NXOS under the hood. They run Sonic operating system. And so that's why Cisco maintains authority, responsibility over the operating system. There's no CLI access. Everything is fully automated in our responsibility. Okay. So in terms of overall components, we've talked about the cloud controller. Obviously, that's where you point your browser, you've got API access there. We also have the 6000 series switches. There's a slide coming up, a couple slides from now, that talks about the different hardware that's available. We can support ports anywhere from 10 to 400 gig. Obviously, 400 gig getting towards that AI-ready network capability. It runs in a VXLAN EVPN underlay. We talked about layer 2 and layer 3. We talked about the different topologies that we're able to support, et cetera. So from a use case perspective, right, if you've got a greenfield data center, depending on the size, depending on the skills, depending on the customization that's needed, this would be something to consider for customers that want that SaaS or cloud managed network experience. If you're, looking to expand maybe an existing data center into a colo, then that might be a good option, because we can basically scale this network down if we need to. So same thing here, downsizing data center footprint. And then finally, well, not finally, but if your customer has like many edge locations, kind of similar to Intersight and UCS, right? Intersight allows you to manage compute across all your locations. This is going to do the same thing. It's going to allow you to manage these different data center fabrics across multiple locations, all from that single cloud managed controller. And then this AI, ML, and high performance compute fabrics piece up here in the right corner, there's sort of a two-part announcement for Hyperfabric. Today, I'm really talking to you about part one coming on February 10th, right? And that is everything that I've been talking about so far. But in the future, there's going to be a secondary sort of piggyback on top of the original network Hyperfabric announcement, and that is AI clusters. And this is where we're able to couple Cisco compute with the AI fabric, sort of a full stack solution. This will be compatible with things like the C885A, and I anticipate, right, that it's also going to be compatible with additional compute that will be coming, like the C845, which is rather than 8 GPU fixed in the 885, you'll be able to configure between 1 and 8 GPU modularly in the 845. We've also got an edge appliance coming. We've also got, I believe, additional GPU capacity on the X440P blade that goes in the 9508. Okay, so that's the idea, right? Is that we want to be able to have an AI-ready network. The switches that will come as part of that announcement will support the necessary configuration and protocol for features like PFC and ECN that allow us to make an Ethernet network lossless for those multi-node GPU workloads. Okay, so that's kind of what's coming. Let me fast forward here. So I'm looking at time to the slide that talks about the hardware. I can kind of quickly point out down here, this is what I was just talking about, right? Where we've got NVIDIA GPU, NVIDIA networking capabilities inside the servers, paired up with this AI-ready network we're introducing called Hyperfabric. I'm going to skip this and go to the switch slide because it's going to take a minute or two to talk through this. So I mentioned two different switch models, the leaf model and what's technically the spine or leaf model. So this is the leaf only model, and it supports up to 60 ports of 10, 25, or 50 gig host facing ports, right? And as I said, if this is the only switch that you design into your blueprint and purchase, then what you're building is you're building this full mesh, spineless data center fabric, right? We can go all the way down to a smaller edge location with one switch up to 5 switches configured in a mesh, and the cable plan will be an export from the design, right? So how to hook this all up will be basically preset for you guys. The second switch is shown here on the left. The switch we saw on the previous slide is shown here on the right. So the spine switch offers 32 ports up to 400 gig, or you can do a 4x1 breakout and get up to 128 100 gig host facing ports, not host facing ports, but spine leaf ports, right? Backbone ports. So pretty high density, 100 gig for a 1RU switch. And then in terms of, the minimum size fabric would be 2 spines and 2 leaves for a spine leaf design. And the maximums over here on the right, 4 spines up to 32 leaves. And as I mentioned, that gets us just below 2,000 host facing ports. So we feel like, the range of the sizes of networks can address a large number of customer use cases. Any questions on the hardware?
None from me.
Okay. All right. So that's really all I had to present today from a slide perspective, but I do want to spend the last couple minutes talking about what I mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is, training and qualification and what that means. So I already said that on February 10th, we're going GA with this solution, and that means the E360 can transact, okay? But you would be transacting as a non-qualified partner. So what does that mean? What that means is every order as it's submitted to Cisco will go into a compliance hold on our end. And since you're non-qualified, that means any deal that you would submit for a customer would also have to include either CX services from Cisco or Mint services from one of our partners to be able to deliver. So how then do you guys become a qualified partner if that's something that interests you? There's, I think, like 3 main things that need to happen. The first thing is we have 2 Mint partners, Lumos and BTA. Don't know if you guys have a relationship, good or bad, with either of those partners, but you would have the ability to choose a Mint partner and go through a single day training. And then after the training, there's a requirement to purchase some lab kit, and there's 2 options for that. Option number 1 is you could purchase basically 2 leaf switches and build a small mesh network, and then that costs 14 grand. And then the second option is a 2-spine, 2-leaf spine leaf fabric, and that option is 31 grand. And then once that equipment arrives on site and gets stood up, there would basically be like a hands-on practical exam to make sure that you guys can, deliver and configure and troubleshoot those types of scenarios. And then there's a black belt exam, basically, that you would need to pass. And we're told that that's actually fairly straightforward and simple. Like Jim and I were told, like, you guys have never configured this, you'd be able to pass. So, those are the details. I will shoot you an email about that, so that you guys can kind of think it over and decide if that's something that you want to do. But again, that would qualify you and make you eligible also for some additional discounts. So, Jim, did you want to say a few words about the discounts?
Yeah, the discounting on hardware is going to be pretty low because, as Dan said, hardware as the overall component of this is a smaller piece. And so pretty fixed, pretty low discounts on it. Software has a higher discount level. I'm hearing, don't hold me to it because it's not GA until next Monday, but I believe the standard hardware discount is like 12% and the software is like 30%. And, that really makes it, for lack of a better term, like Dan said earlier, the switches are basically widgets. They don't even have the software that's attached to the serial number of the hardware. And so, hardware is the thing that fails. Software is the thing that, the smart piece, the management, all that kind of stuff is because of the software on it. And so that's what we're seeing initially on it. But I will say, ideally, very easy to manage. This is for customers that don't want to be in the DCN business at all. They want to be in the airline business, the oil and gas business, the retail business. And realistically, lead times on these and such, you could go from talking to a customer, them being interested, putting together a configuration, getting a PO, taking that BOM that you created or that configuration and converting it into a BOM, ordering it, getting it in and getting it installed in less than a month, compared to what an ACI implementation is. Granted, you get all the automation and all the other things that come with ACI, but I mean, it is easy, get me a quick DCN network up and running and let me get my AI or other projects going sooner than later type of thing.
Yep.